have the connotation of someone who looks at themselves in the mirror and thinks that they are better than everybody else and that sort of vanity, although that's probably included. There are some different meanings to this word, but we'll get to that in just a moment. This book is difficult to pick up and just find a verse that's very encouraging or find a verse that means something, because sometimes, if you don't know the context, you'll find a verse that is very, very challenging. For example, in Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verse 24, you have this: "Nothing is better for a man than that he should eat and drink, and that his soul should enjoy good in his labor. This also I saw was from the hand of God." Nothing is better, really? Nothing is better than eating and drinking. Nothing is better than labor. I thought there was eternal life. And then you have chapter 3, verse 3, that there is a time to kill. In chapter 3, verse 8, a time to love and a time to hate, a time of war and a time of peace. These kinds of verses cause people to squirm a little bit. Chapter 3, verse 19, "For what happens to the sons of men also happens to animals. One thing befalls them. As one dies, so dies the other. Surely they all have one breath. Man has no advantage over animals, for all is vanity." Now, that contradicts a lot of things we teach about being made in the image of God. And then chapter 7, verse 17, "Do not be overly wicked, nor be foolish. Why should you die before your time?" We get that. Don't be overly wicked, although we might question why the word overly is there. Just don't be wicked at all. But then there's the verse before it. Chapter 7, verse 16, "Do not be overly righteous, nor be overly wise. Why should you destroy yourself?" These are verses that cause me some question if I take them just by themselves. Put them in context and they'll all make sense. Lord willing, whether it's sequentially or not, I'll try to study through the book of Ecclesiastes. Something is haunting me, like I did this recently, but I looked through my records and I don't think I did. So if I did, just forget what I said before and listen to me now, and I'll forget that I did it anyway and probably do it again in a week or two. How do you understand these things? How do you understand? First of all, you have to understand the context, the author, and the life situation. First of all, let's just ask some questions about the book. What is vanity? What exactly is that? That's how the book opens. "Vanity of vanities," says the preacher. "Vanity of vanities, all is vanity." Some translations say meaningless, meaningless. All is meaningless. The word is from a Hebrew word that might be pronounced something like Hebel, and it might be related a little bit to Abel, of Cain and Abel. And it simply means nothingness. It means something that is nothing, something that is a vapor, a breath. It's translated in some ways that might help shed some light on its meaning. In Deuteronomy 32, verse 21, you have this. God speaking about the nation of Israel. "They have provoked me to jealousy by what is not God. They have moved me to anger by their foolish idols." And the word for idols there is the word that's translated vanity in Ecclesiastes 1. That makes sense, because an idol is vain. It has no purpose whatsoever except to take people away from God. And then also the word is translated breath. Job 7, verse 16. "I loathe my life," Job said. "I would not live forever. Let me alone, for my days are but a breath." A vanity. And then Job 21, verse 34, Job says, "How then can you comfort me with empty words, since falsehood remains in your answers?" Remember, he had those 3 friends that came around that were chastising him for being a sinner, and that's why he was getting all this suffering, supposedly. He said those were empty words. The ESV translates it empty nothings. It's the same word as vanity. Well, what was vanity? Everything. Everything. Solomon says, as he wrote the first lines of this book. Verse 1, "The words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem," that's Solomon. He said, everything is vain. There's nothing worthwhile. Everything's an idol. Everything's a breath. Everything is empty. Everything is meaningless. That's pretty cynical. That's kind of striking. Well, let's move on. That's what he says. Who is saying it? Well, I went through all those without showing you there. Who's saying it? Solomon is saying it. Verse 1 again, "The words of the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem." First of all, we have reason to question why Solomon would be maybe so blessed as a child because of who his parents were. Remember that David was a man after God's own heart, yet David had his sins. One of those great sins was that he took the wife of Uriah the Hittite and then tried to cover up her pregnancy by his murder. And that didn't sit well with God, of course, and took David a while to figure it out. Nathan the prophet had to come to him and point it out. And then God said, "This child will bring reproach upon the nation of Israel. The child conceived in your affair, the child conceived in your adultery, will bring reproach on the nation of Israel because of his existence, so I'm going to let that child die." Now, a lot of people think that's cruel, but remember one thing, that child will go right on to be with heaven, be with the Lord. And then, after that child died, you remember David had been fasting, he cleaned himself up, and they said, "Why are you cleaning yourself up now?" He said, "Well, while the child was sick, I thought maybe if I fasted and prayed, the child would get well. But now I know there's nothing I can do, and now I know I can go and be with the child, but the child can't come back to me." So David was looking forward to the time to go be with that child. But then Bathsheba, of course, was upset. She'd lost a son. And so 2 Samuel chapter 12, verses 24 and 25 says, "Then David comforted Bathsheba his wife, and went into her and lay with her. So she bore a son, and he called his name Solomon. Now the Lord loved him. And he sent word by the hand of Nathan the prophet. So he called his name Jedediah because of the Lord." Jedediah means the love of the Lord, or one who is loved by the Lord, beloved of the Lord. For some reason, God allowed another son to be born, and for some reason, God loved that child, and for some reason, that child was going to be the next king in Israel after David. Now, a lot of people will fret here and say, why in the world was Bathsheba allowed to be David's wife? In New Testament law, the way God had intended things, that wouldn't be. Why in the world would he allow that sort of thing? Well, I don't know. But God allowed a thought of things in the Old Testament that he does not approve of in the New Covenant, and never really did approve of even in the Old Covenant. You remember in Matthew chapter 19, they asked Jesus, "Why did Moses permit divorce?" He said, "Because of the hardness of your hearts." Well, we might assume that that's why God permitted polygamy too. God never intended it that way. He intended there to be one man, one woman for life, but there was polygamy. David had at least 8 wives, I believe, and several children by them. Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines. God didn't approve of that sort of thing. The Old Testament is not a story about the greatness of individuals, although sometimes we can admire their faithful actions. The Old Testament is a story about how God worked in spite of people's sinful behavior, in spite of what they did wrong. There's nobody perfect. And God's story is about how he worked even though they did some things where they really messed up. So I'm not going to defend David having Bathsheba as wife. I'm not going to say God approved of it. I'm not going to say he didn't approve of it. The Bible just doesn't say. It just tells us the facts that David had Bathsheba as wife, and then they bore Solomon. So Solomon was born of that union. And then, Solomon grew up and he is eventually going to become king. After he becomes king in 1 Kings chapter 1 and 2, then God appears to him in a dream. Let's read starting at 1 Kings chapter 3, verse 1. "Now Solomon made a treaty with Pharaoh king of Egypt and married Pharaoh's daughter. Then he brought her to the city of David until he had finished building his own house and the house of the Lord and the wall all around Jerusalem. Meanwhile the people sacrificed at the high places because there was no house built for the name of the Lord until those days. And Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of his father David, except that he sacrificed and burned incense at the high places." The high places were the groves and the trees and the hilltops where the people worshiped the idols. But even if they weren't worshiping the idols, they had these high places. God wanted them removed. They didn't remove them, and a lot of people still worshiped there in the absence of the tabernacle or the temple. Well, Solomon was doing a lot of things right, but he worshiped at the high places. There would be kings later in Israel's history where it would be said of them, this person did what was right in the sight of the Lord, walking in the ways of his father David, except that he did not tear down the high places. So not anybody was perfect. Solomon had his issues to start with. Verse 4, "Now the king went to Gibeon to sacrifice there, for that was the great high place. Solomon offered 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar. At Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night, and God said, 'Ask, what shall I give you?'" You know the story. And Solomon said, You have shown great mercy to your servant David my father, because he walked before you in truth, in righteousness, and in uprightness of heart with you. You have continued this great kindness for him, and you have given him a son to sit on his throne as it is this day. Now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king," that's me, king, "instead of my father David. But I'm a little child." He's humble at this point. "I'm a little child. I do not know how to go out or come in. And your servant is in the midst of your people whom you have chosen, a great people, too numerous to be numbered or counted. Therefore, give to your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, that I may discern between good and evil. For who is able to judge this great people of yours?" God, here's what I want more than anything. I have this great responsibility. I'm overwhelmed by this responsibility. Have you ever been overwhelmed by a responsibility? Yeah, I'm sure you have. But imagine Solomon. He says, "I'm a little child." I don't think he was a physical little child at that time, but I'm a little child in understanding. And I've got all these great people to rule. And God, I need your wisdom. Please give me your understanding so I can judge these people well. In a kingdom, there wasn't a system of checks and balances. There was not a Congress. There was not a legislative branch, an executive branch, a judicial branch. The king was it. And if you had a benevolent king, that might work out well for the people for a while, but then the king usually turned to corruption, because that's what absolute power does. So Solomon knew that he needed some wisdom to judge these people correctly. He asked for it when God says you can have anything you want. Verse 10, the speech pleased the Lord, that Solomon had asked this thing. Then God said to him, "Because you have asked this thing, and have not asked long life for yourself, nor have asked riches for yourself, nor have asked the life of your enemies, but have asked for yourself understanding to discern justice, behold, I have done according to your words. See, I have given you a wise and understanding heart, so that there has not been anyone like you before you, nor shall there be anyone like you arise after you. Also, I have given you what you have not asked, both riches and honor, so that there shall not be anyone like you among the kings all your days." Okay, you can have that wisdom, you can have that understanding, and then also you get your honor, you get your power, you get your riches. He would. His riches would be legendary, but his wisdom would be more legendary. You remember in the second half of 1 Kings chapter 3, there's a story that illustrates his wisdom. It's even known by the secular world still, I believe, pretty well. We talk about the wisdom of Solomon. His wisdom was first tested when there were two harlots that both had babies, and they kept them with them in their beds at night, probably in very impoverished conditions. One of them rolled over on a baby or something along those lines and killed that baby that night, or the baby died for some reason or another. And then the accusation from the other lady was, she switched babies on me. She put her dead baby in my bosom, and she took my live baby to be hers. And since babies often looked somewhat alike, and since they were harlots and they might not be able to trace who the father was, they had an issue there. So they came to Solomon with that issue. And Solomon said, "Bring me a sword. Cut the baby in two." One lady piped up, "No, whatever you do, don't cut the baby in two. Give her to the other lady, just don't cut the baby in two." And the second lady said, "That's fine. Just cut him in two. Neither one of us will have him that way." Well, Solomon, by the tenderness of one lady, knew who the mother was then. Said, "Give the baby to the mother that said the other lady could have him. Give the baby to the mother that wanted him to live." And that's illustrated the wisdom of Solomon for centuries and millennia now. The wisdom of Solomon, the riches of Solomon became widely known to all the nations. 1 Kings 4:29 through 34. "And God gave Solomon wisdom and exceedingly great understanding, and largeness of heart like sand on the seashore." He could be touched. "Thus Solomon's wisdom excelled the wisdom of all the men of the East and all the wisdom of Egypt. For he was wiser than all men." Remember, they had their wise men, their magicians, their sorcerers, their class of people that they would call the wise men. Solomon exceeded all of those, of course, because God was behind him. For he was wiser than all men. Then he named some people. Then Ethan the Ezrahite, Heman, Chalcol, Darda, the sons of Mahol. I suppose the readers of this book originally would have known who those folks were. And his fame was in all the surrounding nations. He spoke 3,000 proverbs. I haven't counted up how many of Proverbs are Solomon's in the book of Proverbs. But here, 1 Kings 4:32 tells us he spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs were 1,005. Also he spoke of trees, from the cedar tree of Lebanon even to the hyssop that springs out of the wall. He spoke of animals, of birds, of creeping things, and of fish. And men of all nations, from all the kings of the earth who had heard of his wisdom, came to hear the wisdom of Solomon. People came from all around. You know, the Queen of Sheba came to see his riches, his power, his wealth, and his wisdom. And when she saw it, she said, the half has not yet been told. She didn't believe it to start with. When she got there, she said, I haven't even heard half of it. In 1 Kings chapter 10. And then in 1 Kings 10, 24 and 25, now all the earth sought the presence of Solomon to hear his wisdom, which God had put in his heart. Each man brought his present articles of silver and gold, garments, armor, spices, horses, and mules. Watch this. At a set rate, year by year. It seems like Solomon was on some kind of retainer, year by year, to give wisdom to the kings all around him. Because that's what he asked of God, and God gave it to him. Then why would Solomon be so sarcastic, so cynical, and so pessimistic to start off his book, Vanity of Vanities, All is Vanity? We'll trace a little bit more in his life, if you would. Go back to the book of 1 Kings. And in 1 Kings chapter 3, you see a little bit, I keep forgetting to advance this, 1 Kings chapter 4 through 9, you see great things that he did. You read a lot of details about his administration, how much food it took, how many horses he had, how many stables he had, all these things. A lot of these things have been doubted, but then archaeology comes along and verifies these claims that Solomon was indeed that rich. But then you see a little bit of a seed of wickedness in 1 Kings chapter 3, verses 1 and 2. Remember, this is the same chapter, right before he gets that dream from God, ask whatever you will. Now Solomon made a treaty with Pharaoh king of Egypt and married Pharaoh's daughter. He wasn't supposed to do that. Exodus 34:16 had warned against, when the children of Israel came into the land of Canaan, marrying the children of those idolatrous people. Deuteronomy 7 verses 1 through 4 had warned against it as well. Now Solomon is marrying the idolatrous daughter of an idolatrous king of a neighboring pagan nation. And he brought her to the city of David until he had finished building his own house and the house of the Lord and the wall all around Jerusalem. So he was still sacrificing at the high places, and he shouldn't have been doing that. And he married this woman that he shouldn't have married. Then, you see later on that he wasn't such a good, benevolent ruler. In 1 Kings chapter 12, you remember the division takes place between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. When Rehoboam takes over for Solomon, he's wondering about what to do and how to treat the people. The people come to him with a request in 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 4. They say, your father, to Rehoboam, your father, that'd be Solomon, your father made our yoke heavy. Now therefore lighten the burdensome service of your father and his heavy yoke which he put on us, and we will serve you. It was hard working for Solomon, they said. Maybe he taxed him too much. Maybe he demanded too long hours. But maybe that's how he got so rich, was he stepped all over his clientele, his people. Rehoboam, you remember, didn't take the advice of the older people that said, treat the people well and they'll treat you well. He took the advice of the younger people and said, if my father's little finger was thick, then if my father's waist was thick, my little finger is going to be thicker than that. In other words, I'm going to scourge you. He may have chastised you with whips, but I'll chastise you with scourges in 1 Kings chapter 12, verses 10 and 11. And then you see a picture of Solomon's wickedness in full in 1 Kings chapter 11, starting at verse 1. But King Solomon loved many foreign women, as well as the daughter of Pharaoh. Women of the Moabites, people God had specified you shouldn't marry. Ammonites, Edomites, Sidonians, and Hittites, nations all around Israel. from the nations of whom the Lord had said to the children of Israel, you shall not intermarry with them, nor they with you. Surely they will turn away your hearts after their gods. Solomon clung to these wives, these in love. And he had 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, sort of a second-class wife. And his wives turned away his heart. For it was so when Solomon was old that his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not loyal to the Lord his God, as was the heart of his father David. For Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, the abomination of the Ammonites. Solomon did evil in the sight of the Lord, and he did not fully follow the Lord, as did his father David. Then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, on the hill that is east of Jerusalem. That's where Jesus would have been in the Garden of Gethsemane about 1,000 years later. Solomon's building an idol of the Ammonite people there, or the Moabite people there. And for Molech, the abomination of the people of Ammon. And he did likewise for all his foreign wives, who burned incense and sacrificed to their gods, their vanities, their nothings. So the Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned from the Lord God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice and had commanded him concerning this thing, that he should not go after other gods, but he did not keep what the Lord had commanded. Therefore the Lord said to Solomon, because you have done this and have not kept my covenant and my statutes which I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom away from you and give it to your servant. Nevertheless, I will not do it in your days for the sake of your father David. I will tear it out of the hand of your son. So the division between Rehoboam and Jeroboam coming up was determined by God. However, I will not tear away the whole kingdom. I will give one tribe to your son for the sake of my servant David and for the sake of Jerusalem, whom I have chosen. Well, there's why he gets sarcastic. There's why he gets cynical. He leaves God. And when you leave God, there is no meaning to life. People might have a lot of distractions. People might have a lot of things that pull them away one direction or another, keep them real busy, keep them occupied, keep them entertained. But there is no meaning to life without God. Without God, we all just have one breath, like the animals. That verse would make sense from Solomon's point of view. Now later in the book, he corrects it. You remember the great conclusion he comes to at the end. He finally works through all the emotions of being without God and then gets about chapters 11 and 12 to where he's back with God, or at least is writing from that perspective, and says, this is the conclusion. Here's the final thing of the whole matter. Fear God and keep His commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. Or man's all, another translation says. Or the whole, W-H-O-L-E, of man. For God will bring every work into judgment, including every secret thing, whether good or evil. But before that, He's working through a lot of emotions. He's working through a lot of things. And God chose and saw fit for Him to record them so that we could benefit from them. Well, how are we going to benefit from sarcasm, from cynicism, from pessimism? We get to see just how life would be viewed if there were no God, or for the people who have no God. The first 11 verses of Ecclesiastes chapter 1 give us a little bit about how life is meaningless. Work just continues and continues and continues. Verse 3, what profit has a man from all his labor in which he toils under the sun? One generation passes away and another generation comes, but the earth abides forever. Well, let's look at the word toil. The word toil means to labor, and it's with laboring with trouble and mischief. Job 5 verse 7 has Eliphaz saying, yet man is born to trouble as the sparks fly upward. We're born, and all we have is trouble. All we have is toils. All we have is labor. Job 7 verse 3, Job says, so I have been allotted months of futility, and wearisome nights have been appointed to me. Or nights of misery have been appointed to me. That's this word for toils. So in other words, you're born into this world, and if you have no God, if there is no God, or if you're not acknowledging God, everything that you do is just a repetitive task that means nothing. One generation passes away doing that thing, another generation comes. One generation had their revolution, another generation had their revolution. But they all die off, and the earth abides forever. Now that does not mean a literal forever in the sense of an eternity there. Sometimes, as you well know, the word forever means a set period of time. And you can illustrate that with a few verses. I suppose I ought to take time to do that real quickly. For example, Genesis 7 verse 13. God's giving the covenant of circumcision, and He says it would be forever, an everlasting covenant. The Hebrew word olam, forever. He who was born in your house and he who was bought with your money must be circumcised, and my covenant shall be in your flesh for an everlasting covenant. Well, it was everlasting for the time of the Old Testament, but at the time of Christ, He put away the old law, and circumcision is no longer a thing. Galatians 6 verse 15, for in Christ Jesus neither circumcision nor uncircumcision avails anything but a new creation. So the word everlasting, the Hebrew olam, meant for that period of time as long as the law was. And then another example is Genesis 48 verse 4. Behold, I will make you fruitful and multiply you, God said to one of the fathers, and I will make you a multitude of people and give this land to your descendants after you as an everlasting possession. Well, that's what God said in Genesis 48 verse 4, that the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob would have the land of Canaan as an everlasting possession. But He also said in Deuteronomy chapter 28 verses 63 to 65 that if you worship idols, I'm going to pluck you out of that land. It was conditional. I won't take time to read all of that. So not always does the word forever mean a complete eternality. Sometimes it has that context, but you have to look at the context. The context here is this. A generation comes, works, toils, labors. It means nothing. They die. Somebody wipes it out. The temple of Diana at Ephesus took 220 years to build. That's the one that was there when Paul was there. I don't think there's much of a trace of it now, or just ruins. People worshipped at, how long did it take to build the Parthenon in Athens? And people worshipped Athena. How long did it take to build those things? And they're all gone. One generation comes, builds something, another generation comes, builds something, but the earth stays around. It's vanity. And then, verses 5 through 7, the weather continues. The sun also rises and the sun goes down, hastens to the place where it arose. The wind goes toward the south and turns around toward the north. The wind whirls about continually and comes again on its circuit. Sun goes, phenomenologically, the sun, we realize the earth rotates around the sun, but it looks like the sun rises on one side, gets down the other, and then gets ready to come up again in the morning. That just keeps happening. The wind goes on this continual pattern. The weather people figure it out to some degree. It always happens. Verse 7, all the rivers run into the sea, yet the sea is not full. To the place from which the rivers can't come, there they return again. There's an example of scientific foreknowledge. We didn't know about the water cycle in 3000 BC when this was written, 3,000 years ago. The water cycle just keeps happening. It's all vain. Vanity. If there's no God. And then a wearisome pattern continues. Verse 8, all things are full of labor. Man cannot express it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. That's a little hard to decipher. One commentator, Ellicott, says, another translation might be this. Other instances of the same kind might be mentioned, but they are so numerous that it would be wearisome to recount them, all the things that are vanity. Another commentator, Matthew Henry, says this about this verse. All things change and never rest. Man, after his labor, is no nearer finding rest than the sun, the wind, or the current of the river. His soul will find no rest if he has it not from God. The senses are soon tired, yet still craving what is untried. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. It's vanity. And then the passage I like to refer to a lot, verse 9 through 11. That which has been is what will be. That which is done is what will be done. And there is nothing new under the sun. Is there anything of which it may be said, see, this is new? Now our arrogant generation will say, yeah, we got to be on the right side of history with these moral issues. Well, let me tell you, history has happened before. And the side they're talking about was not the right side then, and it's not the right side now. There's nothing new under the sun. It has already been in ancient times before us. There is no remembrance of former things, nor will there be any remembrance of things that are to come by those who will come after. I don't know. I'm not talking about things like electricity. I'm not talking about things like nuclear energy, like fossil fuels, things like that. But what I am talking about is the energy spent by man to make his life better. He always does that. He always comes up with something new. One fellow said the history of mankind is the long story of man trying to find happiness anywhere but God. That's nothing new. And it's vanity. It's grasping for the wind. That's all bad news, except for this. You're not godless people. We're not left without a God. Psalm 90 speaks of the Lord being our everlasting dwelling place even before the mountains were brought forth. From everlasting to everlasting you are God. You turn man to destruction and say, return, O children of men. There's a tension between God's eternality and man's temporality in that passage. Verses 9 through 12 read like this. For all our days have passed away in your wrath. We finish our years like a sigh. The days of our lives are 70 years, and if by reason of strength they're 80 years, yet their boast is only labor and sorrow, for it is soon cut off and we fly away. For who knows the power of your anger? For as the fear of you, so is your wrath. So teach us to number our days, that we may gain a heart of wisdom. Realizing the vanity of things without God ought to teach us to number our days that we have to be right with God, to be wise with them, to awake out of our sleep, to walk circumspectly, redeeming the time because the days are evil, Ephesians 5:15 through 17. Because with God, life is meaningful, even on this earth. Jesus said, the thief does not come except to steal, to kill, and to destroy. I have come that they may have life, and that they may have it more abundantly. Yeah, you get to serve the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. You get to go through life knowing that you're redeemed of your sin. You get to go through life trying to help people, make relationships with people, help them through their hard times, help them find Christ, help them go to heaven. This means something. And then with God, life is eternal. 1 John 5, verse 13. These things I have written to you who believe in the name of the Son of God, that you may know that you have eternal life, and that you may continue to believe in the name of the Son of God. Only with God is life not meaningless. Only with God is life purposeful and without vanity. You know that, and let's try to remember to take that to a world that needs it so desperately. If you've not given your life to God yet, here's how you do that. In this era, in these last days, this Christian era, you confess Jesus Christ as the Son of God, emphasizing your faith in Him, that He is the Son of God, repent of your sins and are baptized for the remission of sins, and then live faithfully to Him. If we could help you tonight, would you please come as we stand and sing?